Adlib presents Unequal, written by David Buckham, Robin Wilkinson, and Christian Straeuli, and read by Daniel York Lowe. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Adlib. Prologue. There exists in corporate mythology, and readily available online, an image of Jeff Bezos captured in 1999, 5 years after he had founded Amazon in Seattle, Washington. In the picture, a 35-year-old Bezos can be seen sitting behind a chunky, yellowing PC monitor balanced on a rickety homemade desk. Computer cables pour out of the back of the old screen, converging messily on an overloaded power outlet lying on the floor. On the wall above his desk hangs a piece of white poster board, somewhat askew, on which Amazon.Com is spray-painted freehand in blue. The picture is often used in articles and presentations recounting Amazon's remarkable success to demonstrate the company's humble beginnings. It is an image that symbolizes the evolution of a tiny startup that, within just 26 years of being founded, would go on to become one of the first corporations in history to achieve a market capitalization of $1 trillion, and which made its founder one of the richest men on earth. For many, the image evokes the very spirit of capitalism in its purest form, the endless possibilities that can be achieved through personal drive and many hours of hard work, no matter one's starting position in life. Over time, the desk that Bezos sat behind in the picture, handmade by the CEO himself from a door and 4 pieces of wood attached roughly as legs, has become embedded in the company's folklore, embodying one of Amazon's most sacred self-proclaimed values, frugality. 2 decades after the photograph was taken, it was reported that the Dutch seaport of Rotterdam would need to dismantle a historic bridge to allow passage to the North Sea for a newly built superyacht. The yacht, commissioned by Jeff Bezos, was being built in Alblasserdam, located 20 kilometers inland. A sailing yacht, as opposed to a motor yacht, it will be the largest of its kind in the world upon completion, measuring a titanic 127 meters. Posing a troublesome obstacle to the delivery of the vessel was the Koningshavenbrug, a railway bridge that extends over the Nieuwe Maas River in Rotterdam. Known by locals as De Hef, meaning the lever or the lift, the bridge's unique design facilitates the lifting of the center span for ships to sail beneath it. It was the first of its kind when completed in 1927. And for citizens of the city, and indeed the whole of the Netherlands, De Hef is considered an iconic part of the country's industrial heritage. After the bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, during which the bridge was damaged, it was one of the first pieces of architecture to be restored, not only as an essential railway connection, but also as a venerable piece of the city's history. Despite De Hef possessing the capacity to lift its center span 40 meters above the water, the 3 towering masts of Bezos's new yacht would not fit beneath it in a proposed transit to the sea. For this reason, it was reported by Dutch media that its builder, Oceanco, had requested a permit from the city to disassemble and reassemble the bridge to facilitate the transportation of the newly built vessel down the Nieuwe Maas. When this became public knowledge in early February 2022, the Dutch media and a number of the country's politicians, as well as many ordinary Dutch citizens, voiced their anger with the plan to dismantle the bridge at the request of the world's richest man. This man has earned his money by structurally cutting staff, evading taxes, avoiding regulations, and now we have to tear down our beautiful national monument, said Stephen Levis, of a local political party in Rotterdam. Dutch citizens banded together on social media to protest the passage of Bezos's yacht, most notably with the creation of a Facebook event called Eren Guren na Superjacht Jeff Bezos. throwing eggs at super yacht Jeff Bezos. Commissioned sometime in 2018, just as Bezos was finalizing his divorce from his wife of 25 years, Mackenzie Scott, the new yacht was estimated to cost in the region of $500 million. Despite its vast cost, however, there was a feature missing from it: a helipad. Owing to its 3 masts, it was impossible to incorporate an area to land a helicopter on the vessel safely. Midway through the yacht's build, with design signed off and construction well underway, this proved to be something of a problem, since Bezos's new girlfriend at the time, media personality Lauren Sanchez, was an avid helicopter pilot. To solve the problem, Bezos commissioned the build of another, somewhat smaller yacht. This would function as a supporting vessel for the main yacht, with the dedicated purpose of acting as a floating helipad. Introduction. On the 20th of July 2021, Jeff Bezos boarded a rocket for a journey into suborbital space. The first manned spaceflight undertaken by the privately funded Blue Origin aerospace manufacturer. The New Shepard rocket reached an altitude of approximately 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, and for 4 minutes its passengers experienced the sensation of weightlessness. The total round trip, from launch to landing, lasted all of 11 minutes. To fund Blue Origin up to that point, Bezos had invested an estimated $5.5 billion of his own money. After touchdown, he addressed the press, still wearing his custom-made spacesuit, accessorized with a comically oversized cowboy hat. "I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer," he said, "'cause you guys pay for all this." If Bezos had taken a minute to reflect on the state of the planet he had briefly left behind during his multi-billion-dollar joyride, his comments to the press may have been more considered. If, while floating 100 kilometers above the Earth, he had looked beneath him, figuratively as well as literally, he may have seen a world that was deeply divided and grossly unequal. A world in which more than 500 million people live in extreme poverty, on less than $2 a day, in which more than a quarter of the global population does not have access to safe drinking water, and the wealthiest 1% holds almost 40% of all wealth, while the bottom 50% holds just 2%. Bezos may have considered that while the average person in the wealthiest 1% emits 48 tons of carbon dioxide per year, the average person in the bottom 50% emits just 1 ton, and that his own company, Amazon, had a market capitalization roughly equivalent in size to the gross domestic product, GDP, of all 46 of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa combined. From the isolation of his space rocket, far removed from the harsh realities of life on Earth, Jeff Bezos may have seen a world divided, not just economically, but ideologically too. Over the past 3 decades, during which time Amazon was created in Bezos's garage and developed into the retail behemoth it is today, there has been a disturbing rise in global inequality. In parallel with this, there has been a repeated weakening and failure of political leadership, especially in liberal democracies. The United States has waged war on itself, both politically and sociologically, at an ever-increasing rate. Surely no one could have predicted in 2015 that in the years ahead a brash celebrity businessman would win the presidency and help polarize his nation to unprecedented levels, that statues of the country's founding fathers would be desecrated and torn down, or that an angry mob led by a man wearing a horned headdress would charge violently into the seat of Congress in what amounted to an attempted insurrection in the world's greatest democracy. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom has offered another discomforting example. In 2020, following its pro-Brexit vote 4 years previously, it left the EU of its own volition. A year later, its Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was at the forefront of the G7's ambitious Green Belt and Road Plan, as he called it then, to ostensibly solve a host of global problems in response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And yet, a further year later, that same Prime Minister was forced by his own party to resign after a string of morally questionable controversies, highlighting the political morass that has beset one of the world's leading democracies. To make matters worse, Johnson's successor, Liz Truss, and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, then fueled further instability through a proposed mini-budget presented on the 23rd of September 2022 that involved cutting taxes for the rich while borrowing heavily from international markets to fund social programs. When the markets reacted poorly to their economic plan, Parliament intervened, the result being Truss's ejection following the shortest prime ministerial term in UK history. And when Rishi Sunak took up the position on the 25th of October, the UK had, for the first time, a new Prime Minister who was wealthier than the King. And in February 2022, only 77 years after the conclusion of the horrors of World War II, Europe once again found itself at war, following Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Despite attempts to use financial sanctions to halt the Russian advance, numerous states around the world, including China and India, continued to purchase oil from Russia at a discount in the months that followed. Even when explicitly condemning Putin's war, several European countries, heavily reliant on imported oil and gas, also effectively continued to fund the invasion through the sustained purchase of these commodities from Russia. This conflict has heightened the threat of nuclear exchange to an extent not seen since the Cold War, and marks the most prominent geopolitical crisis in recent decades, following years of declining global collaboration and withering democratic willpower. Democracy has been on the decline globally, while autocratic regimes have surged and become increasingly explicit in their totalitarian behavior, intensifying their hold over basic human rights and freedoms. It took mere days for the Taliban to gain control of Afghanistan after America's withdrawal in August 2021. Venezuela has self-immolated, creating chaos in South America. Sri Lanka has allowed itself to descend into an economic quagmire, with more than 2 in 3 families short of food. China has sanctified the notion that a single human being can lead for life, and violently suppressed protests by peaceful demonstrators, not only those who are fighting for democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, but also those who have merely protested the loss of their life savings when local banks folded, as happened in July 2022. At the same time, there has been a surge in power and influence among a range of pseudo-democratic leaders around the world, including Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Recep Erdogan in Turkey, who have been democratically elected, only then to pivot towards authoritarianism. Elsewhere, in Turkmenistan and North Korea, for example, outright dictatorships have endured. The world has just emerged from a pandemic that saw 15 million excess deaths in 2 years, during which time the rollout of vaccines was intermittently stalled owing to a combination of political and commercial agendas. Now investments, retirement annuities, and savings are being corroded by persistent inflation, which may embed itself for years to come. All the while, the deep erosion of trust in critical institutions continues, from the United Nations to the World Health Organization to the Federal Reserve, to the point that citizens across the globe have increasingly turned to revolutionary ideas, such as cryptocurrency and decentralized societies, as supposedly legitimate ways forward. While it is difficult to comprehend in isolation how exactly humanity has reached this point, there is a solid, if circuitous, line that can be drawn from the self-absorbed behavior of late 20th century capitalism to today's social and political disorder and the inequality that accompanies it. It was during the mid-1970s, around the time of the Nixon shock and the decoupling of the US dollar from the gold standard, that the first evidence of the fraying of the relationship between capitalism and liberal democracy emerged, as the former, bolstered by a deeply ingrained sense of self-righteousness, began to unwind itself from a reliable set of moral values. This move was initiated and given academic credibility by the revolutionary economic ideas being proposed at the time, most notably those of Nobel Prize-winning American economist Milton Friedman. Through the high-level advancement of these ideas, capitalism, which had until then effectively complemented democracy, began to evolve into what has become a self-serving religion. In the decades that followed, the foundations of modern society were further destabilized with each new case of corporate greed and political deceit. The argument can be made that democracy, in fact, reached its peak in the 1990s, following which the capitalist system has run amok, socially elevating greed and hubris to inevitably destructive outcomes. It was also in the 1990s that a new breed of billionaire began to emerge, distinct from the big oil, finance and pharma billionaires who had become household names. These were the big tech billionaires. At first novel and apparently innocuous, but over time displaying a far more menacing demeanour. Under the guise of innovation, the leaders of the largest technology companies in the world rapidly tightened their grip on the apparatus of capitalism, bending to their will the legal structures meant to protect society from the types of behaviour that destroy competition. Moreover, such behaviour has been glorified in the public eye. Much like the robber barons of the 19th century who monopolised the largest and most influential industries of the time, these modern tech barons have captured and centralised the world's most profitable and influential industries into just a handful of extremely powerful companies. And like the industrialists before them, they have been aided by the systems of the state in doing so, including central banks. In printing excessive amounts of money, beginning in the aftermath of the 2007 and 8 global financial crisis and accelerating significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve and other central banks have flooded the global financial system with trillions of dollars of liquidity. Instead of reaching those who needed it most, however, the money, like water, followed the easiest path and collected in the most accessible asset classes, especially in stocks, real estate and cryptocurrency, as well as in luxury goods, including limited edition watches, designer sneakers and super yachts. The greatest beneficiaries in this period were, therefore, the already ultra-wealthy. In the pandemic era, as millions suffered physically, economically and psychologically, the number of billionaires in the world increased dramatically. Monopolistic tech companies have also exacerbated the divisions and differences that exist between people as a result of the polarizing influence of their technology, especially in the realm of social media. By allowing these companies to reach the size and garner the power that they have, the mechanisms of capitalism and democracy, specifically the guardrails designed to shield society from an uneven accumulation of power and influence in the economic sphere, have failed. In recent years, the most influential corporations in the world have been free to exploit their customers, harvesting their data, manipulating their minds and keeping them increasingly online by playing to their most primal fears and desires. A socially destructive side effect of this phenomenon has been the erosion of common grounds for discussion, and thus a shared vision for the future. There exists now a chasm, economically, politically and ideologically, across which warring factions cannot communicate, but instead simply scream to be heard. As the renowned political scientist Francis Fukuyama has put it, the origins of this trend of deep political polarization can be traced back to what he calls the politics of resentment. This has led to social fracturing in which populist leaders mobilize large swathes of the population around the perception that the group's dignity has been affronted, disparaged, or otherwise disregarded. The political left has shifted from its historical emphasis on the plight of the working class to elevating issues of inequality not just as they manifest in economic terms, but across all layers of difference in the human condition. This drive to identify and protest a multiplicity of perceived inequalities and injustices has been accompanied by an attitude of growing intolerance. On what was previously perceived to be the centre-right, there has been a similar move towards extremism. This has manifested clearly in the belief, promoted by a range of conservative journalists and politicians, that Western culture is under relentless attack from within by the liberal left. Encouraging the divide between these increasingly radicalized political groups by calling for social revolution is renowned French economist Thomas Piketty. Widely regarded as the preeminent voice on economic inequality, he argues that inequality should be understood primarily as a social and political problem, and not as an economic one. He advocates for the idea that a radical change is required to the overarching political ideologies that have brought us to this point. Such a change, he believes, can most likely only be achieved through a social crisis that would have to be larger in its impact than even the COVID-19 pandemic. The realization that one of the most respected economists of our era appears to be calling for revolution to solve the problem of inequality has enormous and troubling implications. As it stands, we face a protracted conventional war in Europe, raging global inflation, ever-increasing economic inequality and political extremism, the collapse of reasoned debate within and between societies, and the rise of unelected world leaders in the form of virtue-signalling billionaires with unknown agendas. This book traces the steady erosion of values and meaning in liberal democratic countries, and the associated rise of authoritarianism that have led to this state of global discontent. In doing so, it seeks to illuminate how this period of capitalism has expressed itself not only economically but through social and political evolutions, as it has steadily uncoiled itself from democracy. Together, these evolutions raise a defining question of our time. Is there an alternative path forward to tackle the problem of increasing inequality and the continued erosion of democracy today that will avoid the crisis and conflict assumed by Piketty? This is a troubling question with no clear answer. Though in witnessing the rallying of Western nations against the threat of totalitarianism immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is, perhaps, a sliver of hope. Part 1. Monopoly and Power in the 21st Century. Burn, baby, burn. That's a beautiful thing. Enron trader talking to a colleague on the phone while watching coverage of the 2001 California wildfires. With energy supplies disrupted in the state as a result of the fires, energy prices would rise dramatically, with Enron due to reap substantial profits. Chapter 1. Civil War at Microsoft. In March 1997, Microsoft was on the brink of civil war. Having dominated the operating system market for more than 2 decades, some of the firm's programmers and senior management were growing anxious that they may have underestimated just how big the internet was about to become. One of the most vocal in this faction was software design engineer Ben Slivka, who stated his case in a presentation titled Microsoft API Strategy, Java is Our Destiny, to a group of Microsoft employees that included the company's illustrious CEO, Bill Gates. Slivka discussed how 2 of Microsoft's biggest competitors, Sun Microsystems Incorporated and Netscape Communications Corp., were focusing their efforts on combining the former's new Java software with the latter's pioneering web browser to design a new cross-platform operating system that could run software programs directly off the web. If successful, this would theoretically make it possible to run any software on any PC using any operating system. In his presentation, Slivka proposed that Microsoft consider doing the same by expanding its focus on Java software and experimenting with its own web browser, Internet Explorer. This would have meant a move away from Microsoft's Windows operating system and technology to innovate and keep up with competitors. Before Slivka could finish, however, Gates issued a harsh admonishment. "Why don't you just give up your stock options and join the Peace Corps?" Turning to the rest of the audience, he asked sarcastically, "Hasn't anybody here ever heard of Windows? Windows is what this company is about." Since Microsoft's founding in 1975 by Gates and his childhood friend Paul Allen, operating systems had been the lifeblood of the business. The pair had met at the prestigious Lakeside School in Seattle, joining forces to embark on their first business venture in 1972. While their peers gathered at the cinema to watch The Godfather, Gates and Allen were applying the final changes to a computer program they had created to measure traffic volumes in Seattle. When the program was sold to the local government, they reportedly netted $20,000 in the deal. At the time, Gates was just 15 years old and Allen 17. Despite their growing passion for computer programming, after finishing their schooling, Allen enrolled at Washington State University and Gates, in accordance with his parents' wishes, attended Harvard to study law. Their studies were soon brought to a halt, however, thanks to a revolution in the computing world that would prove impossible to ignore. The release in 1974 of the first commercially successful microcomputer, the Altair 8800, which became the forerunner to the personal computer. Until the 1970s, bulky, expensive mainframe computers were used almost exclusively by large organizations, such as universities, government agencies, and big businesses. The Altair 8800 and other subsequent microcomputers, small, personal use computers based on single-chip microprocessors, represented a crucial new first for the computing world, in that they could be purchased, unassembled, and then constructed and programmed by amateur enthusiasts to perform basic functions. Initially, they remained a niche product that appealed predominantly to computer and electronics hobbyists, but Gates and Allen believed that this would soon change. In fact, the pair were so confident that in 1975, they contacted the manufacturer of the Altair 8800, Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, MITS, and informed its president, Ed Roberts, that they had developed a tailored version of the widely used computer language, BASIC, specifically for use on the Altair. They were bluffing. No such code existed. But their salesmanship proved so effective that the president granted them a meeting to showcase their code. What followed was a frantic effort to produce the code, which ran so close to deadline that when Allen flew to Albuquerque and arrived at the meeting 8 weeks later, it still had not been fully tested. It nonetheless ran without fault, and MITS agreed to distribute and market Altair BASIC. On the 4th of April 1975, shortly before the end of the Vietnam War, Microsoft was founded, the name of the company a portmanteau of the words microcomputer and software, with Gates acting as president of the company and chairman of the board, while Allen took up the position of executive vice president. The venture was perfectly timed. Just as Gates and Allen had predicted, microcomputers were rapidly superseded by more advanced personal computers, PCs, that by 1977 could be bought off the shelf, such as the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the Tandy TRS-80. Mainstream uptake of these devices began to drive explosive growth in the PC market, and Microsoft was soon developing software for several computer companies. Its big break came in 1980, when development of IBM's first PC began. Although IBM had historically been at the forefront of each new wave of development in the computer industry, its primary focus had always been on mainframes, and it was consequently late to enter the burgeoning PC market. 3 years after its competitors had released their first PC models, a team of just 12 engineers was finally allocated to the development of an IBM PC. Realizing that IBM needed to make up for lost time, the PC development team decided to make use of an open architecture, building a device using externally produced components that were readily available on the market. In line with this strategy, IBM approached Microsoft, which by that time had established itself as a leading developer of computer programming languages, especially BASIC variants, to assist with the creation of an operating system for its new computer. Having determined that it would not be possible to build an operating system in the timeline required, Gates opted instead to simply buy an existing one and modify it. In July 1981, Microsoft paid $50,000 for QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, to a small company called Seattle Computer Products. This was turned into MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System, and licensed to IBM in an agreement worth $430,000, just in time for the release of the IBM Personal Computer 5150, which had been under development for a year and which became available for purchase in August 1981. The most important part of this deal for Microsoft lay not in the creation of MS-DOS itself, but in the careful details of the contract it agreed with IBM. Given that the latter company had expected Microsoft to charge a higher rate up front for the operating system, or alternatively require a per-copy royalty payment, it agreed to a request for a clause to be included in the contract that allowed Microsoft to retain the rights to MS-DOS. This meant Microsoft could license the software to other PC manufacturers, such as Compaq, Acer, Packard Bell, and HP, as well as to IBM. It was the deal that would, in the words of Wired's John Helaman in an article in 2000, be the foundation of Microsoft's empire. Chapter 2. Microsoft's Signature Strategy. In 1983, Paul Allen resigned from Microsoft after being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Despite the loss of one of its founders, the company entered a significant new phase in its development when Gates announced to the world that same year a forthcoming Microsoft product that would forever revolutionize operating systems for personal computers: Windows 1.0. At the time, Apple was in the final stages of preparing to release its first Macintosh PC, which introduced a novel graphical user interface, GUI, that allowed for text and images to be displayed on the screen. This system could also be navigated using a mouse, providing a more user-friendly alternative to Microsoft's text and keyboard-driven MS-DOS system. Realizing that the Macintosh threatened to undermine Microsoft's growing dominance in the operating system market, Gates repeated a formula that had proven successful for him once before, and began to market the idea of a Microsoft operating system with a GUI before any meaningful plans were underway to develop such a product. This would enable the company to gauge market interest in Windows 1.0 and, if it proceeded with the development of the operating system, it would encourage customers already using MS-DOS to wait for Windows instead of changing to the Apple system. 2 years later, in November 1985, Windows 1.0 was finally released. It was not an immediate success, with many customers complaining that it was slow and cumbersome. This was not a major concern for Microsoft, however, which by this stage had become known for a business strategy that focused on getting a product to market as fast as possible, however unrefined it might be, then relying on the clout of the company's brand and the bundling of its products with the operating system to carry it through while its engineers worked to improve subsequent versions. As Windows grew in technical acuity, becoming rapidly more popular among customers, Apple initiated a copyright infringement lawsuit, claiming in 1988 that Microsoft had stolen the idea of the GUI that defined the operating system. The lawsuit began to lose steam, however, when Xerox Corporation filed a similar suit against Apple, claiming that the Macintosh GUI was derived from a Xerox computer interface called STAR. Ultimately, Both lawsuits proved unsuccessful, with the court ruling that copyright infringement could not be applied to GUIs in general terms, and only applied if the precise expression of elements such as icon images, menus, and the opening and closing of objects were directly copied. In March 1986, Microsoft went public with an initial public offering, IPO, that raised $61 million, granting the software giant a market capitalization of $777 million, in what many analysts at the time described as the IPO of the year. Over the following months, Microsoft's share price continued to rise rapidly, carrying Gates to the position of youngest billionaire in the world at the age of 31. He debuted on the Forbes 400 annual list of richest Americans for 1987 with a net worth of $1.25 billion. By the end of 1990, Microsoft had released its third iteration of Windows, and its annual revenue surged past $1 billion for the first time. By 1992, Gates was the richest man in America, with a net worth of $6.3 billion. A few months earlier, he had been invited to appear on the cover of the August 1991 issue of Fortune magazine with Steve Jobs, under a headline that read, "The Future of the PC." On newsstands throughout the country, the two men could be seen seated side by side at the bottom of a spiral staircase, smiling uncomfortably, alongside news that Cheers had won the Emmy Award for Best Comedy Series for the fourth time, and that Ukraine had declared independence from the USSR. For 29 years, Gates would maintain a position in the top 2 of the Forbes 400, only dropping to 4th place in 2021, when his $134 billion net worth was surpassed by Jeff Bezos, Tesla CEO Elon Musk, and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. By 1993, 1 million copies of Windows software were being sold per month. Its success was greatly bolstered by Microsoft's signature business strategy, which involved bundling Windows software with other new applications to produce suites, which it then persuaded leading computer makers to preload onto their computers. One of the first examples of this was Microsoft Office, launched for Windows in 1990, which bundled applications such as Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and Excel into one convenient system for office use. This strategy was hugely successful, enabling Microsoft to keep pace with a rapidly advancing industry while simultaneously ensuring that its operating system would not be rendered obsolete. In the process, Microsoft was all but obliterating smaller competitors such as Satellite Software International, the developer of WordPerfect, the world's first word processor, and Lotus Software, which produced Lotus, the world's first spreadsheet application. Both WordPerfect and Lotus were popular programs during the late 1980s and early 1990s that ran on the MS-DOS system, and were compatible across the range of PC models and operating systems available at the time. They quickly began to lose market share to Microsoft's versions of these programs, however, which operated with a GUI that users found more appealing. With Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel bundled into Microsoft Office, there was also little demand for additional non-Microsoft programs. Any company that was successful that was doing software basically had two options, noted John Mittelhauser, a founding engineer at Netscape, reflecting on Microsoft's growth many years later. One was Microsoft copied what you did and did it better and got a business. Two was you got bought by Microsoft. They were the 800-pound gorilla. In addition, to further ensure that Windows remained at the core of the PC industry at large, Microsoft made use of a billing strategy that involved charging PC manufacturers for long-term licenses of its software, based on the total number of PCs sold by the manufacturer, regardless of whether they were loaded with Microsoft software or not. This strategy attracted the attention of the Federal Trade Commission, which initiated investigations into Microsoft's business practices in 1990. Ultimately, in July 1993, the Commission deadlocked with a 2-2 vote on the question of pursuing legal action against Microsoft. The Department of Justice, DOJ, decided to pick up where the Federal Trade Commission closed its investigations, making its own inquiries during the latter half of 1993. Based on its findings, the DOJ filed a civil complaint in July 1994, alleging that Microsoft was using exclusionary and anti-competitive methods to market its operating system. By inhibiting competing operating systems' access to PC manufacturers, Microsoft's exclusionary licenses slow innovation, raise prices, and deprive consumers of an effective choice among competing PC operating systems. Read the official DOJ competitive impact statement. Microsoft refuted the claims, counter-arguing that it was simply producing a superior product at a competitive price. In August 1995, a settlement was reached in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, in which Microsoft agreed to a consent decree that, among other things, reformed its billing practices as they pertained to contracts with PC manufacturers, and most importantly, restricted the company from tying other products to the sale of Windows. This effectively meant that Microsoft could not force its consumers to buy additional Microsoft products, such as Microsoft Word, when purchasing the Windows operating system. This would theoretically ensure that customers maintain the option of purchasing alternative products, such as WordPerfect, and using them with Windows. This restriction on tying was, however, essentially nullified by the fact that the consent decree did not address the issue of integrating products with Windows, that is, fully embedding additional products into Windows in a technical manner so that they cannot be separated without compromising the functionality of the operating system. In other words, Microsoft was in a position to accept the consent decree without significant concern because, though the company could not compel its customers to buy additional, technically independent products when buying Windows, it could still fully integrate its products with Windows, effectively ensuring that additional products came free with the operating system. The technical distinction between tying and integrating was one unappreciated by the DOJ at the time, and overlooking it proved to be a crucial mistake, as it allowed Microsoft to continue to distribute its products by fully integrating them into the world's most widely used operating system. This made it exceptionally difficult for smaller technology startups to get a foot in the door of a rapidly growing market. After all, there was little incentive for customers to pay a separate licensing fee for a non-Microsoft product when the Microsoft version came free with Windows. Stanford economist Garth Salona described Microsoft's core strategy many years later. "We will embrace it, we will make it ours, we will apply it to our operating system, and we will kill it. We will do what we must to protect the mothership, the OS." This approach explained why Gates had balked at Ben Slivka's suggestion in March 1997 that the company should orientate itself away from Windows. That simply was not how Microsoft operated. The same year the consent decree was signed, 1995, the implications of the DOJ's failure to acknowledge the problem of integration became clear. That August saw the release of Windows 95, which for the first time integrated Internet capabilities, including, most significantly, Internet Explorer 1.0. From this point, Microsoft continued to grow at a staggering pace. By the end of 1996, just 10 years after the company went public, it had reached a market capitalization of $100 billion. By the end of 1999, at the peak of the dot-com bubble, Microsoft was posting sales of $19.7 billion. Its market capitalization had reached $614 billion, and Gates's personal wealth had climbed to $90 billion. Chapter 3. Amazon.com. Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the 12th of January 1964, to teenage parents Theodore and Jacqueline Jorgensen. The couple had married a year before, when Jacqueline was just 16, and the marriage was short-lived, with Theodore abandoning his young family not long after his son's birth. when Jeffrey was 4 years old, Jacqueline married Miguel Mike Bezos, a Cuban immigrant who was studying at the University of New Mexico. Soon after, Miguel made the decision to officially adopt his new wife's son. Jeffrey Wilkinson's name was legally changed to Jeffrey Bezos. The family moved to Miami, Florida, where Jeff Bezos completed his schooling at Miami Palmetto High School, working at McDonald's as a short-order cook to earn an extra income, often during the breakfast shift. After graduating from high school, Bezos was accepted into Princeton University, and in 1986 he graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and computer science. While at Princeton, he was president of the university's division of an international organization called Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, SEDS. After graduating from Princeton, Bezos joined a fintech communications startup called Fetel, and in 1988 made the move to the world of Wall Street banking, joining Bankers Trust. After 2 years, he took up a position with D.E. Shaw, a newly founded hedge fund with a strong emphasis on mathematical modeling. Bezos quickly moved up the ranks, attaining the title of senior vice president at the age of 30, and it was there that he met his future wife, Mackenzie Tuttle, when she applied for a role as a research associate at the firm in 1992. 2 years later, a few months after they were married, Bezos left D.E. Shaw to start his own company. Although he did not know exactly what he would sell, he knew that he wanted to build a business that was specifically designed to take advantage of the growing potential of the internet, which at that stage was still very much in its infancy. Eventually, he settled on the idea of an online bookstore. Bezos did not have a great passion for books, and his decision to sell books as the first product on Amazon.com was an entirely practical one. They ticked the right boxes for Amazon's business model. In a video interview with Richard Wiggins in 1997, Bezos explained how he chose books as the first product to sell. 3 years ago, I was in New York City working for a quantitative hedge fund when I came across this startling statistic that web usage was growing at 2,300% a year, he said. So I decided I would try and find a business plan that made sense in the context of that growth. And I picked books as the first best product to sell online, after making a list of 20 different products that you might be able to sell. Books had a quality that set them apart from other product categories. There was an enormous variety of them in existence. Specifically, there was no physical store that could hold every type or title of book on its premises. Other products that came close to fitting the bill were CDs, computer hardware, computer software, and videos. But books were the obvious choice in the end. Books are incredibly unusual in one respect, noted Bezos in the interview with Wiggins, and that is that there are more items in the book category than there are items in any other category, by far. At the time, there were roughly 3 million titles in print, yet the largest physical bookstores could only hold around 150,000 books. In an online marketplace, however, where the number of titles was not limited to the amount of space on the shelves, the selection could theoretically be endless. In its first few months of existence, the online bookstore did surprisingly well. Within 2 months, Amazon had already made sales to customers in all 50 states in the US, as well as to customers in 45 countries across the world. Remarkably, within that time, it was already recording approximately $20,000 in sales per week. Just 2 years after opening its virtual doors to customers across the globe, Bezos decided to take the company public. In the initial registration form, Amazon declared that the average daily visits to its site had grown from approximately 2,200 in December 1995 to approximately 80,000 in March 1997. The company noted in the filing that the worldwide book industry was large, growing, and relatively fragmented, adding that it had positioned itself to take advantage of this by using the internet. Amazon.com issued its initial public offering of stock on the 15th of May 1997, listing on the Nasdaq at $18 a share. A year later, in 1998, Amazon started selling products in addition to books, initially music CDs, before branching out into other categories, including toys, electronics, and tools. By December 1999, Amazon had shipped products to more than 20 million customers in more than 150 countries around the world. That same month, Jeff Bezos was named Time magazine's Person of the Year. The cover read, Amazon.com's Jeff Bezos, e-commerce is changing the way the world shops. Chapter 4. Netscape 72, Microsoft 18. In the early hours of the 1st of October 1997, while Microsoft employees celebrated the launch of the fourth iteration of the company's Internet Explorer web browser at a party in San Francisco, a small group of software developers left the festivities intent on making mischief. Taking with them a 3-meter by 4-meter prop of the browser's logo, which had formed the centerpiece of the party decorations, they made their way to the nearby campus gardens of Netscape Communications Corporation, at the time the largest player in the browser market. Amused at the thought of their competitors arriving in the morning to be greeted by Microsoft's beacon of success standing in front of their company's offices, the Microsoft team departed and awaited news of the reaction to their prank. By the time most Netscape employees arrived for work the following morning, however, Microsoft's IE logo had been unceremoniously knocked over. Lying on its side in the dirt, atop the logo stood Netscape's signature Mozilla Dragon mascot bearing a handwritten cardboard sign that read, Netscape 72, Microsoft 18. The sign referenced the fact that at that point, Netscape held 72% of the browser market share, while Microsoft held only 18%. The remainder was split between a handful of other browsers, including Opera, Lynx, and Mosaic. Netscape had released the first iteration of its browser, Netscape Navigator 1.0, in 1994, and with almost no competition in the market, it had been embraced by all major PC manufacturers and installed on their products, making it the de facto browser used on personal computers around the world. Up until the release of Windows 95 the following year, Microsoft had, in contrast, largely ignored the rising influence of the Internet, continuing instead to focus almost exclusively on the development of its operating system. By 1995, an estimated 18 million American homes had PCs equipped with modems. And while this meant that less than 10% of the US population was making use of the Internet on a regular basis, there were many in the industry who believed that it was only a matter of time before it became the defining development of the late 20th century. Within a decade, roughly 70% of the US population will be using the Internet. Realizing that it had erred in neglecting Internet developments, Microsoft integrated its first Internet browser, Internet Explorer 1.0, with the release of Windows 95 in August 1995. For the first time, Netscape, which at that point held 95% of the browser market share, faced some real competition. While Gates would continue to position Windows as Microsoft's flagship product, he had recognized at this stage that the Internet could not be ignored. I have gone through several stages of increasing my views of its importance, he wrote in a memo circulated in May 1995 titled The Internet Tidal Wave. Now I assign the Internet the highest level of importance. In this memo, I want to make clear that our focus on the Internet is crucial to every part of our business. The Internet is the most important single development to come along since the IBM PC was introduced in 1981. For the following 3 years, Microsoft competed in what was routinely referred to internally as a jihad with Netscape for browser market dominance, with each company releasing new and improved iterations of their respective browsers. Initially, Netscape maintained an advantage as its browser was technically superior to Microsoft's early versions of Internet Explorer. But Microsoft had the power of its operating system, with which IE had been integrated, which was now powering most of the world's personal computers. Internet Explorer, which is the web browser that's part of Windows 95, is part of the functionality of Windows 95, Microsoft's senior executive Greg Shaw told the media in October 1997. So when we license Windows 95 to PC manufacturers, part of the license of that operating system is the requirement that all of the functionality of Windows 95 be provided to customers. When Microsoft released Windows 98 the following year, it similarly came with the latest fully integrated version of Internet Explorer, which by this point matched Netscape Navigator in terms of technical capabilities. Thus, Internet Explorer 4.0 came built in and at no additional cost, with the newest iteration of an operating system that was already being used on almost every personal computer in the world. With such a package available from Microsoft for a single licensing fee, it made no sense for users to pay for a second, separate license to install Netscape Navigator on their PCs as well. Critically, as Microsoft would later argue, by fully integrating Internet Explorer as a feature of Windows, it had not violated the 1995 consent decree it had signed with the Department of Justice 3 years before. They sort of spread the Explorer code throughout the Windows code, so that if you tried to remove it, you would actually mess up all of Windows, explained Andrew Gavel, an antitrust professor at the Howard University School of Law. There was no technical or business justification for writing it that way. The main reason to write it that way was to make it not removable. Within a year of releasing Windows 98, Internet Explorer had eclipsed Netscape Navigator, which became one of the shortest-lived success stories in Silicon Valley history. More than that, as Gary Rabach, the antitrust lawyer who would later represent Netscape, argued, what Microsoft was doing was not just damaging to a company, namely Netscape, but it was damaging to a whole new generation of technology. Chapter 5. Browser Wars. Netscape was founded in April 1994 by Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark. Andreessen, then aged 22, had worked on the development of the Mosaic Internet browser while studying computer science at the University of Illinois, while Clark, aged 50, was an established businessman, having founded Silicon Graphics, which sold computer hardware and software. By the end of the year, the pair had released Netscape Navigator 1.0, which laid the groundwork for a series of pioneering web browser advancements that worked to make the World Wide Web more readily accessible to the average user. By the end of 1995, the faster and more powerful Navigator 2.0 was released, with plug-in architecture that enabled programmers to begin to develop new software applications to further